Hi there, and welcome to Baseball by Design. I am SportsLogos.net minor league baseball correspondent Paul Caputo, curator of the Sunday Helmet Hall of Fame in my basement in Fort Collins, Colorado. This week on the podcast, we're going to be talking about the Staten Island FerryHawks, a member of the Atlantic League of Professional Baseball, who, of course, play in one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. Later on in this episode, we'll be speaking with Sky Dillon, the designer who created this brand. We'll be speaking with author, New York baseball fan, and member of the sports media, George Falkowski. And of course, Dan Simon will be here with one of his Studio Simon Stumpers. Right now, I am so pleased to be joined by Eric Shuffler, who is the president and owner of the Staten Island FerryHawks. Eric, good morning. How are you?
I'm great. Super excited to be on. Love what you do. Love talking about the importance of brands and team names, and really excited. Thank you.
Well, this is a case study in unique nicknames in the baseball landscape, right? Like this is one where there's not a lot of places where the team is going to be called the FerryHawks, and so so I'd like to start with that. Like, what in your mind, what is a FerryHawk? Why is that name appropriate to Staten Island, New York?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's so important for these minor league teams to have names that represent the community, names that really couldn't be the name of any other team in another place. And I think when we looked at Staten Island, you know, the ferry is one of the iconic things that people think of Staten Island culture, the Staten Island ferry. And, the hawk is very prominent on Staten Island. The people on Staten Island tend to be predators. They tend to be, strong and aggressive. They watch out for each other. And, I think the combination of the two really became a unique way to capture something that is very much a part of the Staten Island ethos. And, it wasn't a name that we chose. It was a name that really emerged out of a public process.
As you describe this brand and as you describe FerryHawks and why that name is significant to Staten Island in particular, I look at this logo and I see, and it's a really serious hawk, right? Like he's not smiling, he's not cartoonish, right? Like this is it's a serious brand. How come this hawk is so serious and intimidating?
We felt that was, kind of the Staten Island brand was tough and strong and, maybe a bit intimidating. And we wanted the hawk to reflect that ethos. We do joke around that maybe in a year or two we'll come out with a friendlier kid version of the hawk as an alternative version. But for now, we felt the hawk captured the Staten Island attitude. That was important to us.
The hawk itself, is it a particular species? It says on Wikipedia that the red-tailed hawk and the Cooper's hawk are native to Staten Island. Was that part of the conversation in terms of what the actual hawk looks like?
It was part of the conversation. We actually thought about naming the hawk Cooper for the Cooper's hawk and also Cooperstown. But, after a lot of deliberation, we ended up with Frankie, a name that really would resonate more in Staten Island with its strong Italian heritage. And that proved to be another, winning choice.
Part of the history of this team, not directly but indirectly, is the fact that the Staten Island Yankees played there. They lost their affiliation in the great Vogon Destructor Fleet reshuffling of minor league baseball. And, that team ultimately couldn't survive that, that transition out of affiliated ball. And then so in come you all with the independent Staten Island FerryHawks. How important is it to you just in general, the fact that there is baseball in or on Staten Island?
I'm not a native Staten Islander, so I speak from what people tell me, and I think it's extremely important for several reasons. One, Staten Island is a hotbed of baseball. It has probably the best little league, in the 5 boroughs. It takes its little league extremely serious. They have multiple runs to the Little League World Series. So sports and baseball in particular have a very strong history on Staten Island. Bobby Thompson was a Staten Islander. There's several guys in the majors. Tom Cosgrove now with the Padres is a Staten Islander. They are always battling for city championships, Catholic city championships. So it is very much part of their DNA. And I think there's another element of Staten Island, which is, many people in Staten Island refer to it as the forgotten borough. Not a huge fan of that because I think it really is this incredible borough that doesn't get enough credit and isn't looked at in the way it should be. So having your own baseball team is a way to kind of anchor the profile of an area and build around it with something that is yours. And that also was kind of part of our thinking on the team name, was we wanted to have a name that Staten Island was proud of and represented the strength and pride of Staten Island and really was unique to Staten Island.
You say you're not native to the area. I'm curious to know how many times, if you can possibly count, how often are you back and forth on that ferry? How often have you taken the ferry?
Oh, I'm there 4 to 5 days a week,
Uh-huh.
pretty much every game. So, I am on the ferry many, many, many times.
So can you describe that experience? I've never taken this ferry. I do love a ferry. That's a it's an amazing way to get around in places where that's necessary. I'm curious, just what is that experience? From when you get on the ferry to when you disembark.
Yeah, it's a tourist experience in some ways and a commuter experience in other ways. I tend to take it um, mid-afternoon or late morning or end of the evening on the way back. It is a tourist experience a lot of times. You hear lots of different languages.
Okay.
See lots of families that are there clearly as part of their New York City experience. You go by the Statue of Liberty and everyone is rushing to the sides to take their pictures. So that's one experience. There's
Mhm.
also a second ferry that just started in August of 22 that takes a little bit of a different route, and that has an upper level, and that to me is a lot of sightseeing. And I think what's
Mhm.
great about the ferry is you see a tourist, you see your guys and women, hustling to work, and you see people just kind of taking that half-hour ride to enjoy, do some work, read the paper, look out the window at the awe that is, the Manhattan skyline, or out to Brooklyn and the Verrazano, look out to the Statue of Liberty. I like taking it after games because I like taking it back with fans, and it's a chance to talk with fans about their experience. And what we have found is taking the ferry is part of the experience of coming to a FerryHawk game. It's part of the adventure.
It's funny that you say that actually, because I feel that way anytime a team involves any kind of public transportation to get to. I love that experience. I remember taking public transportation to games in Wrigley and Fenway. The game experience to me starts earlier and ends later when you get to and from the game on public transportation. And I love the idea that getting to and from this game also involves, depending on where you're coming from, going back and forth on this ferry.
Paul, it also makes it a little more communal
Hmm.
because you're having a shared experience. I'm a Mets fan, and I take the 7 train to Shea City Field many times, and there is that shared experience with other Met fans, and the game's more important. People cheering, singing. It definitely adds to the experience. And I think when you're on the ferry and you get to go see the Statue of Liberty, or your kids are there and get to go on a boat ride, and you're looking at that really incredible view, especially at night, coming back after a 6:30 game, it is part of the adventure. We hear that a lot from fans, especially ones that are coming from Manhattan. It's part of their game day experience that they really love.
That is, as a great segue to my next question, which is, I imagine that as you are taking the ferry, you yourself, that you're hearing a lot from the fans and you're getting a lot of feedback, whether they realize they're giving it to the president and owner of the team or not. What has the reception been in the couple of seasons that you guys have had? How have the fans embraced this nickname, and what have you learned on this journey?
Yeah, the fans love the name. I think that is, we can argue what we got right, what we didn't get right. The name universally has been loved. And I think that became clear quickly. We had a voting contest and we put the names out to the public and had several rounds of voting. And every time we did it, Barry Hawks was by far the leader. And when you would be out talking to people, it was by far the leading choice. So that we feel really good about. I think on the fan experience, what I love talking to fans about is, one, how they hear about the Ferry Hawks, and second, what they like about the experience. So I find the Ferry Trips really insightful
Yeah.
for people giving me suggestions on the game day experience, the music, the food, the kids' entertainment. Once you get people comfortable, and I always acknowledge who I am, so I'm not some random person coming up,
Hmm. Hmm.
grilling them on their Ferry Hawk experience. And there's people, I give everyone my card. They'll email me, say, listen, go home, think about it, email me. And I've gotten some really great feedback from people about suggestions on it.
Yeah. I imagine that's a really great way to focus group, if, for lack of a better word. But what a great way to receive.
And people are always amazed that I'm on the ferry with them. They just don't expect that.
Is there one that when you are on the ferry or you're in the team store, is there a mark in particular that fans are particularly drawn to?
I think they're drawn to the basic hawk flying out with the Verrazano in the background.
Hmm.
That is by far our most popular one. I like that one because to me it captures the strength of Staten Island. It captures, the bridge in there. He's got the green belt, which represents one of the green belt of Staten Island, a huge open space.
Hmm.
It represents strength and aggression, and that I think is the one that everybody likes. It's my favorite too, but I love the one that we call the Bobby Thompson mark, which
Hmm.
is the ferry hawk hitting the home run
Yeah.
over the harbor out towards Manhattan, towards the Statue of Liberty. I
Yeah.
just think it's maybe a little more fun, and I'm a baseball nostalgia guy, so as we were going through, it's something that brought out one of baseball's greatest moments. Is kind of cool for me.
I do want to touch on something, an interesting sort of side note about the team, not specific to the logo and the actual brand identity, but the larger brand of the team. Part of the sort of the lore of the team, the history of the team, is that the first woman to play in the Atlantic League was Kelsey Whitmore. That's obviously a landmark occasion for this team. Can you tell me about what that experience was like for the team and how that came to be?
Kelsey is still with us. She is an amazing baseball player. I think the thing that I most respect about Kelsey is she is a baseball player who happens to be a woman.
Hmm.
And really, in that order, the team has embraced her. They treat her like one of theirs. They see how hard Kelsey works. And, when you hear about people who are pioneers and groundbreakings, you always wonder about how people around them will react.
Hmm.
And I'm really proud of how our team has reacted.
Hmm.
Again, they treat her like everyone else gets treated. The fans, I think that's been the coolest thing, is seeing her impact on fans,
Hmm.
men, women, but especially young kids and especially young girls. When she gets up at bat, there is a buzz that just takes place through the stadium. It's like, if Aaron Judge gets up, like everybody wants to watch. And then you start hearing cheering.
Hmm.
So it's inspiring to watch that. It has been very easy for all teams to adjust to that. We've not had an issue with anyone, any place with her. She is a rock star.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a cool part of the story of this team. And I love your characterization of the fact that, Kelsey is a baseball player who happens to be a woman, because I think that's the perfect way to approach that. So obviously part of the history of, baseball in Staten Island is, I referenced the Yankees. They had a sort of classic traditional, boring parent club name. Their foray into establishing an alternate brand was the Pizza Rats, very famously the Pizza Rats, which generated a lot of conversation. It had sort of there was a sort of love-hate relationship with that. A lot of people thought it was a lot of fun, but a lot of people didn't appreciate it and thought it didn't represent the community. I'm not asking you to take a stance on the Pizza Rats one way or the other, but obviously with that as a as a backdrop to the process of establishing a new team and a new identity in Staten Island, how did that influence your conversations?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was a significant influencer in the sense of the name sold a lot of merch,
Hmm.
and it definitely had people who liked it. But by and large, when I came in and John Catsimatidis and I, we heard a lot from political leaders, elected officials, and fans that it was a name they weren't proud of. It was a name they found offensive, that they were embarrassed about, that didn't reflect Staten Island or knowledge of Staten Island. And it was one of those requests: whatever you do with a name, one, don't go Pizza Rat, and
Hmm.
second, it has to be a name that we can be proud of and that represents all that's good about Staten Island. We don't want these names that are backhanded compliments or backhanded insults. And there was a lot of feeling that that name did it,
Hmm.
and that we had to get this name right in a way that everyone on Staten Island could be proud of. So that was a humongous framework for how we entered the process.
Yeah, that's. I mean, those are all great points, right? Like, what an important part of that conversation as you establish, this new team. Eric, I appreciate you joining me from your vacation. We
Just
established in the
just some
pre-interview
days off,
conversation.
just some days somewhat off
Okay,
while the team's
okay.
on the road.
All right. Well, that's I'm glad you're able to have a little bit of time, and I appreciate that you used it to come talk to me for this podcast. Thanks very much, and best of luck with the waning days of the season here. And I hate saying that out loud because I love baseball season so much. And best of luck to the team going forward. I think it's a really fun brand and really fun to talk about. And now I'm going to have to find it on a. Do you all do the ice cream helmets with the FerryHawks
We
brand on it?
do. We do. We have them in orange and blue, two
Uh,
colors. And I think we actually have it where you can get two different logos on it.
oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Because
That's a
I'm
strong.
I'm a dork, so I wanted to have that where people could have some options or collect them.
Well, let's not get into who's a dork about this because I have a shelf behind me with 450 unique ice cream helmets out there. So
Well, send me your address. I will get you some of ours. I have about 20 in my kitchen counter that my wife is always like, when I come back with my kids who aren't kids anymore, she's like, why do we keep bringing these home? Like, because someday they're going to bring them out and they're going to remember all these trips. So until then, we keep them all.
John Hodgman always says the difference between a hoarder and a collector is a display case, and so that's
I like that.
So Eric, thank you again. This has been a lot of fun, and best of luck to you and the team.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
I am so pleased to welcome back to the podcast Sky Dillon, who created the Staten Island FerryHawks logo. Sky, how are you doing? It's great to see you again.
I'm doing great, Paul. How are you?
I am doing really well. You're back on, and we're talking about this one particular brand that you worked on, which has been really fun and really received positively, I think, out there in the world. The Staten Island FerryHawks. What were the considerations that you had going into this project? What did the team ask for? What did you bring to it? And what were you trying to accomplish?
As always, excellent question to get us started, Paul. This was an interesting one because they were in the process of finding an ownership group when they already knew that there was going to be a team on Staten Island. So roughly January, the year that we eventually worked on the identity and later launched it in November, about January in the timeline, they had not yet solidified an ownership group, yet they had a good sense that there would be a club coming to Staten Island. And so just proactively, the league engaged us on, just kind of getting the ball rolling with perhaps exploring some name options or whatnot. So we did a deep dive in January as far as, what are some potential names that we could eventually utilize or whatnot. That process ended about a month in when they finally did land on an ownership group, and turns out that the owners that they ended up going with had a really good sense of baseball. Eric Shuffler really spearheading that group. And because of really their, really attunement to the sport and really the desire to really have, a good amount of influence on the eventual identity, they, kind of shifted gears 180 degrees, and the name the team contest was then really executed from the team level throughout the summer. So it was good in the sense that it gave us really kind of that initial dive into Staten Island and all the potential themes that existed there. But then the team really took the reins as far as, following through on a formal name the team. So we, kind of went back to the bullpen, so to speak. And then September, they came back with the finalists of, I believe at the time it was Harbor Heroes, Dragon Slayers, and FerryHawks. Mm-hmm. So that was those were the finalists that the team came up with. And then in September, we were re-engaged with that new ownership group to begin the process.
Okay. So did you create sketches? Did you do any preliminary work on those other brand names that were part of that contest?
Yeah, so we didn't even really get that far. We were really just, thematically just getting dipping our toe in the water, so to speak. And it was funny because at the time we were, there's the Game of Thrones connection to Staten Island. So we were thinking along medieval lines, which for the listeners that aren't aware, apparently the author of Game of Thrones used to live in a high-rise in Jersey City, and his office was overlooking Staten Island in the distance. And so as he was writing this fictional narrative of medieval lore, that, the distant mysteriousness of Staten Island really was inspiration for a lot of the kingdoms and different lands that existed in Game of Thrones. So there's a lot of really cool stuff there. You also had the King of Staten Island with Pete Davidson, kind of pop culture wise was popular at the time. So again, King, Staten Island, our heads were kind of in that area of maybe it's something related to that medieval thing, but with a modern twist.
If you really wanted to pay tribute to George R.R. Martin and the Game of Thrones idea, you could have promised a finished logo for 7 years and then just decided, nah, forget it. So
Right.
little great Game of Thrones joke there on Baseball by Design. That's we're 90 something episodes in, and that's my first Game of Thrones joke. So so you mentioned the hawk in particular, and you sent me this very cool PDF with a lot of the research that you've done and logos that involved birds and hawks in particular, and a lot of photos of different hawks and some illustrations that you did as part of your process. I'm curious to know whether you at some point targeted a specific kind of hawk, or was it a more sort of generic, like a Seahawk, which is not a real kind of bird, or officially anyway. Was it more generic, or did you end up honing in on a specific kind of hawk that was particular to that area in some way?
So yeah, as we began the creative process and the team came to us with those names, it was so important when we started the design process to get ownership on the same page with what is a fairy hawk. It's not an eagle, it's not a bronco, it's not this literal symbol that folks already have a normal image in their mind of what it is. The fairy hawk really had the ambiguity to become whatever we wanted it to be, to tell the story of the baseball team that they wanted to tell. And so that PDF you alluded to was our defined phase presentation, where we basically said, okay, we're going to remove any current thoughts that we may have as far as what this identity should be, and we're simply going to look at the essence that we're trying to convey, which we had already established, that which was gritty, strong, loyal, chip on the shoulder. The fairy hawk rises up in times of great need, and of course loves baseball. So really an encapsulation of the persona of Staten Island, really being that underdog borough with really this just good heart, like a loyal people on Staten Island are true to their roots. And so using that as kind of our guiding light, we came up with 4 buckets that really were a way for us to get a temperature check with the ownership on where they wanted to land. So the first one was what we called Swagger, and it was our retro fairy hawk. So picture this barrel-chested fairy hawk, super strong and kind of a retro style from an artistic standpoint, to pay tribute to a lot of the really rich baseball history that exists in the Manhattan, New York area. The second direction was what you have alluded to initially, which was Hunter. So this really super modern, sleek hawk, which for the listeners, picture like a stylized Seattle Seahawk, fast motion, sleek, really kind of bold in nature in that regard. Let's see, the third was Protector. So it was this idea of playing off that first responder idea of rising up in times of great need. What if this fairy hawk was almost like this ghost-like figure that was always ever present with the ferry as it crossed back and forth across New York Harbor? So it could be a cloud, it could be a wave, it could almost be like this mythological being that we could create this whole new meaning for what a hawk is in terms of that mythological route. And then finally, the fourth one was Transformer. So this idea that thinking of all the innovation and change and positive ambition for this new direction for the future of the island. This idea of a fairy hawk playing off of that metallic nature of the ferry itself, and picture almost like a Optimus Prime as a fairy hawk. So this Transformer character that is amphibious but also can fly in the same way that the ferry is going back and forth across the harbor as a vessel, a maritime vessel, but the hawk obviously alluding to something that's airborne. And so it was kind of like in minor league baseball, there really are no rules when it comes to what your mascot can look like or can be. And so for us, that really represented that far end of the spectrum creatively, in contrast to that initial direction with the barrel-chested, very traditional fairy hawk wearing a baseball uniform. So for us, it gave the owners a wide range of ideas to think about and consider, and feel like we'd left no stone unturned. And so from that, they eventually combined two, coincidentally. So that idea of the spirit of a retro fairy hawk with lots of swagger, and also this idea of a protector and a very heroic fairy hawk rising up to help those in need. The one interesting anecdote that came from sharing those initial ideas was, we're not fictitious. There's nothing that's fake about the people on the island. There's nothing that's so like that third direction that I mentioned that had the that mythological ferry hawk, for example. Super cool idea, and probably would have a lot of traction in a lot of other cities where that idea of this a made up character, so to speak, would be fun and interesting. But just knowing the tenor of the folks on the island, very raw, very authentic, very true in regard to just the ethos there. And so something like that would not have been a proper fit for that particular audience, which is why we go through the process and kind of are thorough in that sense and explore lots of ideas like we do.
Where you landed, as you mentioned, you have part sort of spirit guide and part retro design. It seems like in designing for this audience, it was very important to actually get the literal landmarks of this place into the logo itself. Is that particular to this, New York, the borough of Staten Island, that there's a pride that goes into being from there? What was the decision in making sure that you literally represented the ferry and the bridge in this logo?
Yeah, you nailed it. That's exactly it. Really conveying the sense of pride that folks on the island have for their borough, and in lockstep with that, at the end of the day, it's part of New York City, and there's lots of tourists that visit, with the Staten Island Ferry being a very common attraction for tourists that are visiting. It's a free ride to take that from downtown Manhattan to the island and back. You pass the Statue of Liberty, you see the New York skyline. So all that being said, those symbols are really the fabric of what represents the island on a universal level. It was important that as we went through this, that certainly there's room for Easter eggs here and there. For example, the belt on the hawk is green as a tribute to the green belt, which is the moniker for their park system. So that's kind of a fun Easter egg that you don't necessarily have to get in order to understand the brand as a whole. But the ownership was very clear from the beginning. This has to be a tough, strong, heroic hawk that's ready to compete. As a reflection of the spirit of the folks on the island, and it has to contain those iconic symbols of Staten Island that anyone around the world will recognize. So the ferry, number one; Verrazano Bridge, number two; and of course, with the splash of the harbor really being the backdrop to the entire mark.
The type that you created for it has a traditional baseball feeling about it. Has it feels, I don't know. I don't know if, I guess type can do this, right? It feels very New Yorkish to me, right? Like it has a just sort of traditional arc that you might see on a baseball jersey, but maybe it's just because I'm associating it with the rest of the logo here, but the type feels really New Yorky to me.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because that was our last hurdle in the process. The team loved the name, obviously. They loved once we came back with the potential themes, in love with those two that I mentioned that we eventually merged into the final direction. They loved how the hawk was turning out. All those things were the colors, obviously paying tribute to the orange of the ferry, the blue of the harbor, the green of the green belt, and even the rock gray that we use, paying tribute to the name of the island being the Rock. So the rock gray really is the anchor color. And we were at the finish line, literally the 11th hour. We're in November, the launch is in a couple of weeks, and that, being true to the process and saying, no, this is, anything that we do, we're doing with excellence. And, there's no stone unturned. There's no part of the identity that we don't do at the, to the highest level, so to speak. And that last piece that was just not quite complete was the typography. And, we went around and around a little bit, and ultimately landed on a typeface that is basically born from that really quirky yet charming font that you see on the side of the Staten Island Ferry. So, for the listeners, if you look up a picture of the Staten Island Ferry, it's kind of this fun. It's got a little bit of whimsy to it. It's got a little bit of charm to it. There's really some great character to those letter forms, almost to the point where it's too quirky. And initially, the team was like, maybe that's a little bit too far. But as we worked with it, that really became the foundation for the font that we landed on, where we took really the F and F is really and the S, both letters found on Staten Island Ferry, capital letters. Coincidentally, we had the S and the F really bookending our FerryHawks word mark. So that's where we landed. We took that font, really streamlined it, made it more baseball, oriented as far as the arch and the thickness. And then the final, detail that was that really put it over the top was those kind of curved serif treatments on the middle of the letter forms and on the end of the letters. And that was a way to, those curved kind of pointed serifs kind of feel like hawk talons, hawk feathers, but also there's an element of like tattoo calligraphy to it as well. So it's a very raw, very rough letter form that, again, thinking about the audience, Staten Island, like that's a part of the motif of Staten Island is like really cool tattoos. So
Right.
again, it doesn't really hit you over the head with it, but
Mhm.
all things being considered, now that you take a step back and look at it, it has a lot of that DNA. And I'll mention as an aside, about midway through the process when we were talking about what the theme was, this whole idea of a kind of a renegade hawk and kind of this chip on the shoulder. For a period of time, briefly, we entertained the idea of almost like a pirate theme, where you had this ferry as the ship going back and forth. You picture the flag being raised with a hawk skull and crossed bats as our Jolly Roger,
Right.
So to speak, and almost think like the Oakland Raiders, the black, that kind of an attitude. And so all that being said, it eventually came out in the form of the typography with that really raw and aggressive type, if you will. And then one more note I'll have on that is the SI monogram that obviously uses that same typography was a way to pay tribute to the old Giants that used to be in New York, and they had that interlocking NY, orange colorway, kind of that same curved, pointed serif treatments that you'll see on the New York Mets, old Brooklyn Dodgers caps. So there's a lot of that DNA that pays tribute to like the old iconic baseball lore that exists in the shadow of New York City from back in that era.
This is why I love doing this podcast so much, because like learning details like that, I hope everyone who is not driving or like out for a run or whatever did exactly what I just did now as you were saying this, which is I immediately went and Googled the Staten Island Ferry, and I could immediately see what you were talking about, how the type for the team derives from that. And what an amazing detail, right? I love that so much. So I do have to ask you, just before I let you get out of here, I'm curious to know, did you go ride the Staten Island Ferry as part of your process?
Well, of course. I mean, one of the benefits of being based in New Jersey is Staten Island is basically our neighbors. So I've ridden the ferry many times, very familiar with it, but it was an excuse to get back over there and do it with a pen and pad in my hand, taking down notes of inspiration as I did so. So yeah, most certainly that was one of the highlights.
I love it. I happen to love New York City, and talking about a team like this, and I'm out here in Colorado, and I did get to go to New York recently this year, but this just makes me nostalgic for getting to New York City. So now I really have to go see a Staten Island FerryHawks game, and perhaps you can come join me and we can share an ice cream helmet.
That would be fantastic.
Sky, this has been so much fun.
We can raise the Jolly Roger together, which, by the way, Paul,
yeah,
as kind of one of those ideas that came to me while we were riding the ferry was this idea of Bobby Thompson, again, most iconic baseball player in the history of Staten Island. He wasn't born there, but spent a lot of his time living there. And he was known for his infamous shot heard around the world to win the pennant for the Giants back in the day. And so you'll see one of the marks that we have in the system is the FerryHawk hitting a home run into New York Harbor over the ferry with the Statue of Liberty in the distance, as a way to kind of pay tribute to that. Again, everything that we did was authentic. There's nothing made up here, so to speak. So everything pays tribute to New York baseball or the island in some form or fashion. And that was just another nod, kind of embedded within the identity.
Sky, that's a great detail. Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you told me about that. That is a really terrific detail. That's really fun. Well, I have kept you way longer than I meant to. I knew I would, right? I knew that was going to happen. I don't know why I even bother saying that anymore. But thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. And we'll catch you next time. There's a lot more logos you've done that I want to have you back on to talk about here on the podcast.
Fantastic, Paul. Hey, always appreciate it. Really love what you do.
Oh, thank you for that.
You got it, Paul. Have a good one.
Talk to you soon. All right, everyone, welcome back. I am very pleased to be welcoming to the podcast for the very first time long overdue George Falkowski, who is the author of Meet Me at the Bat. I'm doing that thing where I hold up a book that my guest has written, even though it's an audio podcast, but I want George to see it in my grubby little mitts. Meet Me at the Bat. It's an expression that you explain in the book, is something that all Yankees fans will know. It's a landmark at Old Yankee Stadium where, in the days before cell phones, you had to establish where you were going to meet, where everyone was going to get together before you went into the ball game. And there's a great big bat there waiting for you to be the meeting spot. So it's a great name for a book. George, how are you doing?
Good, man. I hope you got the version that where the graphic artist at the publishing company spelled forward correctly.
I have an early vintage copy with forward with an A.
Yeah, nice job, graphics guy.
That just makes this one a collector's
Only in the
item.
early copies.
That's what I'm saying.
We get them to correct that.
This is like the Billy Ripken card that has a bad word written on the end of the bat.
I should mention, while we're talking about the bat's still there.
Okay.
The stadium is gone. There's a park on the grounds with a baseball diamond in the same place, a couple of softball fields.
Mm-hmm.
But as you come out of the new Metro North station, the bat is still there.
So all of this, George, is to establish your bona fides as a legit baseball fan, a reporter. You've had a lot of on-field experiences out there in the world of Major League Baseball and minor league baseball. You are a consumer, you're a fan, an enthusiast, you're an author about it now. And you are New York through and through when it comes to baseball fandom. And so Staten Island is, of course, part of that tapestry that is New York baseball. So we're talking about.
I have to throw one little sidebar in there.
Oh yeah,
is that I always say God has a sense of humor, and to prove it, I worked 10 years as a features producer for the New England Sports Network, your capable home of the Boston Red Sox and Boston Bruins. And I'm the only kid who grew up in New Jersey, loving the Yankees, who can say honestly on your show that I love the Red Sox. I love their history. But back to Staten Island, I apologize for the diversion.
That's okay. Staten Island, the FerryHawks. I'm curious to know from you, just as a fan of baseball, a baseball person in New York, how important is it that there is baseball in Staten Island?
And the great thing about Staten Island's ballpark is that it might be the greatest view in minor league baseball, which if you've been there, you're looking right out at New York Harbor. You can see the ferries coming across, hence the new nickname FerryHawks. You can see what was the World Trade Center site. Like we used to cover games there for News 12. We would shoot stuff and you could see the Twin Towers, and now you can see the Freedom Tower.
Yeah.
And it's sunset, like, evening dusk. Oh my goodness, what a sight. Now, the only problem with that is actually getting to the park. That's always been the hamstring injury for the Staten Island pro teams. The team is having a pretty good second half this year. I think they're right there for the second half title, which would be awesome.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's a great park, and they try real hard, and it's great for Staten Island, but it's just not an easy place to get to.
In terms of the FerryHawks, one of the things they've done is that they've reached out and they've had a high-end designer create this brand that made something of a splash, and this sort of like defiant-looking New Yorker, hawk himself on the ferry. And we've talked already on this episode about some of the details in that logo, but they definitely tried to capture that sort of New York spirit with this brand in a way that definitely the Staten Island Yankees did not. But that does bring us to the question of the alternate brand the aforementioned alternate brand from the Staten Island Yankees, the Staten Island Pizza Rats, who were named for a viral YouTube video of a rat dragging pizza down some subway stairs or up some subway stairs.
He was bringing them down.
He was bringing them down into the subway. Yeah. It stirred emotions. Some folks felt like it portrayed a negative stereotype of New York and New Yorkers, whereas others thought, hey, this is a really fun play on something that happened on social media, and it's the sort of ultimate underdog story, this rat who got himself a slice of pizza.
That would have been me.
You were famously you were adamant in your support of this Pizza Rat brand. I'm not from New York, so I don't get to say, right? Like it's not.
Sure. I mean, look, if you're buying the stuff, you have a say in it. But
Well,
so people know the background.
Yeah.
Is that I know you're a huge advocate for teams dropping the parent team name. Staten Island Yankees, Syracuse Mets, whatever the deal was.
Yeah.
So the Staten Island management decided to hold a contest to rename the team. And as it happens, Pizza Rats was one of the 4 finalists and it won.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting at Chasing News at the time thinking, this is the greatest. I'm going to buy 8 hats, 27 shirts. This is hysterical because, New York, you gotta kind of have in New Jersey too, you gotta have an attitude, right?
Right,
And it's like,
right.
Pizza Rats, what's more New York than that?
Yeah.
Whether you like it or not, it happened. It happens. Go to the subway today. There's probably far worse things happening that you're not going to name your team for. So I guess immediately that the parent club would be very unhappy.
Yeah.
And they were. So suddenly the Staten Island Yankees put out a press release. I'm pretty sure it was 2017 that said, you know what? It's too late in the season. We can't rebrand. It'll be too hard. We're going to keep the Yankees logo, the moniker for another year. And I remember tweeting them and saying, you don't know how much money you guys just let go out the window. Well, fast forward a year, I'm still at Chasing News. I look in the on the wire services and it says I got an email and they're going to try the brand, but it's only going to be Saturdays.
Yeah.
Like 6-7 Saturday games and like 1 camp day game.
Right.
Well, those guys, if I remember correctly, sold more stuff in 3 days than they did the entire 2017 season. Not that the Staten Island Yankees brand was, but they had some nice stuff.
Yeah.
But Pizza Rats, are you kidding me? And they brought it back the next year, and I was sure the Yankees were just going to go nuts. But in the end, what's minor league baseball supposed to be about? It's supposed to be about fun.
Yep.
And I hope for the sake of the team ownership and the management, it's about making money.
Yeah. George, what a pleasure to get to finally talk to you on the podcast. This has been fun, as I knew it would be. Where can people find you on Twitter and elsewhere?
Well, at George Falkowski, if you can spell that, it's F like Frank, ALKOWSKI. My handle is 363DP. As a former president of the First Basemen's Union, my campaign slogan was "Not everybody can play first base." Thank you very much.
I like it.
And I think we all know this, that if we keep what you want to call it, Twitter or Twitter X or X, if we stick to the fun stuff and the stuff that people enjoy, baseball, also for me, hockey, my kids play. I've been around hockey for 40 years too. We should do a whole podcast on that. If you keep it to fun stuff, it's actually a pretty positive place to go. And I think you've certainly proven that with what you've done on Twitter over the last number of years, with the shows that you guys do, with Anna, with Baseball Bucket List, with Johnny Bolin, the average post. All our buddies out there. I mean, everybody, Pat Larson with the hats, you with the ice cream. Everybody contributes so much to this community, and you can really make it a positive place where there's so much toxicity and so much really bad stuff out there. It seems that we've carved out a really cool corner, and we're inviting you all in. If you want to have fun and keep politics and all that stuff out of it and just enjoy sports and baseball and the minors and that, come join us, follow Baseball and Ice Cream. You're happy to tag along with me. That's fun. You want to get the book? Great. I'm working on another one, but it's a wonderful community, and that you guys even include me in it. Really, it's flattering. It really is. And I thank you for that.
Well, it's certainly not up to us who's in and who's out, right? Like you were very much a part of it yourself, and it's certainly been fun to follow you. And like I said, so glad to finally get you on the podcast. You can find Meet Me at the Bat on Amazon now, with 100% fewer typos than the collector's item.
The original. Thank you, graphics guy. And just for those who haven't been part of that train, it does center, the theme is the late 70s and early 80s Yankees, but it's really about me discovering a bag of old ticket stubs and picking out 32 games that I vividly remember. And it's really more about the people that I experienced the games with. So you don't have to be a Yankee fan to kind of get it.
So is the second book going to be about all of the QR codes you've discovered in the deleted files on your phone?
Actually, no. The second book, the working title, you've seen me use it on social media before, is Ballpark Therapy.
Oh, very nice.
And the theory on the book is why people like us use the ballpark as an oasis.
George, this might set the record for the longest wrap-up of any interview I've done.
Wow.
So.
Hard
Thanks
to believe
again, George.
I've been paid to talk my entire life. It's really...
We will talk to you again on this podcast, I promise, and it won't take 90-some episodes to get back to you.
I'm awesome. Happy to do it, and thank you for having me on.
It is time once again for your favorite segment of this podcast, Dan Simon's Studio Simon Stumpers. Dan, good morning. How are you?
I am, as always, fantastic. Thank you.
We are talking this morning about the Staten Island FerryHawks. So I am ready. So many areas where you could be, where you could go with this one. So I'm just going to sit here and see what you got.
Okay. Before we get into the question, I just want to mention that the creator of the Staten Island FerryHawks identity is Sky Dillon, as you guys already know, because he's already been on this episode.
Mm-hmm.
Sky is a good friend of mine and a frequent collaborator, even though the great majority of the work done here at Studio Simon comes from my hand. Sky has been involved in numerous Studio Simon projects. Sky is a great designer, a great guy. I'm talking up one of my competitors, a competitor to the point that it was down to 2 designers for the Staten Island FerryHawks brand identity development. Sky Dillon was one, Studio Simon was the other. Sky Dillon got the job. So we brand identity professionals coexist, I think, very happily, not just Dan Simon and Sky Dillon, but Todd Radom and Joe Bosack and all the rest of them out there. As a very happy fraternity, we are competing against each other, but I can speak for myself only, but I feel that this goes for others as well. We are happy whenever we see each other's success. So with that in mind, not with that in mind, because what we're going to talk about now has nothing to do with sports branding. As a matter of fact, it has to do with Staten Island specifically. So on Staten Island, by the way, I was born in New York City, born in the Bronx, lived my first 7 years in Queens, though we moved to suburban New Jersey when I was 7. I went to the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan. My dad's office was in Manhattan for most of my life. So I'm a New Yorker myself. I have to admit, of the 5 boroughs of New York, the only one I've never been to is Staten Island.
And you wonder why Sky Dillon got that job.
Touche. So here we go. On Staten Island, there was a statue that served as a memorial commemorating the borough's little-known tragedy, an attack on one of the Staten Island ferries. Specifically, the ferry's name was the Cornelius G. Kolff, and that attack led to the sinking of said ferry that sent nearly 400 passengers to their cold, watery graves on November 22nd, 1963. Now, few know about this tragedy because of what happened later in that day. This is not yet the stumper, but do you know what happened later that day, November? This happened very early in the morning, this sinking of the Cornelius J. Kolff on November 27, 1963. What happened shortly thereafter that day?
Is that JFK?
That was indeed. So good. You know what? I'm going to count that as part 1 of the question. You are correct in the first part of the non-multiple choice aspect of Studio Simon Stumpers. Yes, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated that day, and that monopolized the news coverage and the headlines. So very few people heard about this attack on this Staten Island ferry. Full disclosure, another reason few people have heard about it is because the whole thing was actually an elaborate hoax dreamt up as a practical joke by artist Joe Reginella as an art installation in 2016. But he created an actual statue, put it out by the waterfront, and people, there was nothing on it that suggested this was not an actual event. So our studio Simon Stumper today asks, according to art installation artist Joe Reginella, what sank the Cornelius J. Kolff Staten Island ferry? Was it A, a Russian submarine, B, a giant octopus, or C, a UFO?
It's an art installation. This is amazing. What an amazing story. You had me hook, line, and sinker there with this. I was sure that there was a tragedy. You described it as a tragedy, but I think you also described it as an attack.
Well, it was an attack, and the result was certainly tragic. 400 passengers going to their watery graves. And you said I had you hook, line, and sinker. It had a lot of other people hook, line, and sinker too, because though it was tongue in cheek, it was not presented as such. It was presented as fact with an actual sculpture. This is a sculpture of a significant size on the waterfront.
I think I'm going to say if it got a lot of people, if it had a lot of people believing, I'm going to say that UFO is probably a little too out there. So not UFO. I'm going to say Russian submarine for an art installation. That's pretty real. But what's he saying in 2016 with a Russian submarine? Well, I don't know. There was a lot going on in 2016. But octopus for an art installation. Dan, I'm going to say that because this is an art installation and because it was the outrageousness of the idea of a giant octopus attacking a ferry and sinking it, I'm going with octopus.
Paul Caputo just took both ends of the double stumper.
Stumper.
Yeah. You are correct, Paul. So your role continues, and you had me a little worried there when you said, if this fooled so many people, you're going to rule out a UFO right away. So the thinking was good there, but if you're thinking that it fooled so many people, wouldn't a giant octopus be a little bit of a tip-off that maybe this didn't really happen? So I was a little worried then, but you eliminated the Russian submarine for whatever your reasons were there, and you landed on the correct answer. And it is, I've seen, anybody can Google this, if I've seen the sculpture itself, and it's actually pretty good. It's a Staten Island ferry with with the parts of the octopus that were not submerged coming up over it and wrapping around it. It's really pretty good.
I'll tell you what my thinking was, Dan, was that the UFO is not believable at all to me, especially if for a news item, right? Like, I mean, that we would have heard about since November 22. The Russian submarine was just a little too on the nose, and so the octopus seemed just outrageous enough to really capture the imagination while also potentially being a real thing. So that's how I landed there. I don't know if my thinking was any good, but it got me to the right place.
Well, but perhaps that was Joe Reginella's thinking in developing this idea. And I would like to think, here we are 7 years past when he first did this. Not first did this, when he did this. And I'd like to think that he would be pretty excited to hear that people are still talking about his art installation. There's a really good chance he's listening to this podcast. So, hey, Joe, hello to you. Kudos to you. You're great idea and of this art installation, and know that its legend lives on.
This podcast is the MASH finale of podcasts. It's, you can just assume, 8 out of 10 people are probably listening at any given point.
I think that's you are underestimating the numbers.
Dan, Simon, thank you so much. As always, this is so much fun. This one was particularly fun. I really enjoyed this one. So thank you for bringing your Studio Simon Stumper to Baseball by Design. We will see you next week, right back here for another Studio Simon Stumper.
I am looking forward to seeing you. I'm looking forward to hopefully your role continuing. So have a great week. See you in 7
seconds.
That would leave that in, Paul.